Welcome to the Art of Procurement, the official podcast of the Catalyst Co-community. And our purpose is to enhance the impact of procurement by elevating the discussion one conversation at a time. Here at Art of Procurement, Catalysts come together every single week to share their challenges, ideas, successes, and perspectives on the business of procurement. Hi there, everybody, and welcome to episode 232 of The Art of Procurement. I'm the host, Philip Eidson, and out of the 232 podcasts that we've had today is actually the first time that we dig into GPOs, or Group Purchasing Organizations. And so, as I planned out this topic, it's just something that I wanted to talk about for a long time and never really had the opportunity to. So I reached out to today's guest, Jay Black, and asked Jay if he would join me. Jay is Vice President at Insight Sourcing Group, and specifically, he's responsible for their GPO offering. And Jay also has significant experience outside of Insight Sourcing Group in the GPO space, selling and operating services under a number of different GPO delivery models. And I'll be honest and say that prior to today's discussion, I always felt that a GPO fit a really specific market niche in terms of smaller companies. In fact, in a previous role, I actually looked at setting up a GPO within my procurement organization to support our customers, who are a lot of small businesses, as kind of a benefit that we could give as a procurement organization to our clients, and help actually use a GPO to drive revenue. Today, though, our conversation really opened my eyes to the use of GPOs in larger organizations and also using GPOs as part of a multi-dimensional approach, not just a GPO because I'm a small company. So Jay and I explore in today's conversation the nuts and bolts of GPOs, so when and how to use them, what to look for, and how to continue to benefit once any initial one-time savings with specific suppliers have actually been exhausted. Well, I started the conversation, as I often do, by asking Jay if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
That's a good question. I would say procurement definitely found me. Mm-hmm. So I'm not a practitioner by training. Really, the majority of my exposure to procurement has come kind of in the last 10 years or so of my career, and largely, kind of focused on solutions and operations in the group purchasing space. Mm-hmm. I've been really fortunate to work with large multinational organizations, private equity operating partners, CPOs, CFOs, and suppliers, kind of all touching really both strategic and tactical aspects of procurement. I'd call it a bit of baptism by fire, which is kind of great for me because it's the way I learn.
You learn by doing.
Exactly.
What got you involved in group purchasing organizations in the first place?
It's interesting. I actually spent some time on the supplier side, mm-hmm. Selling into and kind of managing some of the GPO programs in the space. And so that was really my initial exposure. Obviously, kind of found my way into the GPO itself. Kind of spent some time both domestically and internationally on the operations side. So I guess it was a bit of a natural progression to the extent that it could be.
And so for context for listeners, what is it that you do today?
Yeah, so I currently lead the group purchasing practice for Insight Sourcing Group. Mm-hmm. So really, if you think about that, my team owns what we'd consider to be the centers of excellence around the categories represented in the GPO. So for example, office supplies or rental cars. Yeah. We really have responsibility for all aspects of the group purchasing efforts. And then we also serve as kind of functional SMEs, if you will, for the sourcing projects and other things that happen across our firm.
Interesting. So it's while it's an independent offering within Insight Sourcing Group, it's not necessarily its own tower, if you will. There's still a lot of integration with other areas of the business and other sourcing activities that Insight does outside of a GPO environment. Absolutely.
I think we see GPO as a portion of a broader procurement strategy and sort of address it that way.
So I'd love to know, before we actually go into a little bit more detail about GPOs, if there's a particular lesson learned or an aha moment that you've taken from your career that has maybe informed then actions or perspectives that you've taken as you've progressed your career.
Yeah, it's a great question. Honestly, Phil, I'd answer that with probably connection is the real currency, which may be a little bit more of an abstract, kind of thought. But if I level up from just my role in a given situation, that could be vice president, that could be dad, that could be husband, whatever, right? And I kind of reflect on success in any capacity. I'd say it's largely due to the relationships or the connections that I have, right? And if I also look at failures, or better described as opportunities to kind of learn, right, in my life, I can clearly attribute those to, either potentially broken connections or lack of relationships. So I think for me, it's really making a conscious effort to overinvest in those connections and those relationships with empathy, and then kind of a desire to advance value.
You talked about turning failure into an opportunity to learn, and that's a lot easier said than done. I wonder, is that a mindset or for you personally, or is there some way that you've kind of forced yourself to make that a habit, so that you do reflect on failures or on lessons to be actually able to apply them going forward so that you hopefully don't make those same mistakes again?
Sure. I think just from a personal perspective, it's an awareness that failure is an inevitability, right? In some capacity. And so, I certainly wouldn't suggest that I'm able to cope with it better than anyone else. It's more or less sort of, just recognizing the opportunity to understand that it is what it is, right? And that there is always something to learn from that. And so just really kind of reflecting on it and taking away from it what you can. Yeah.
And that self-awareness piece is really important. It's something I've talked about a lot more on the show recently, is actually taking a step back and figuring out perhaps, where you are in the context of some of the things that you're working on or the relationships that you have. It's often easy to lose sight of that, and you think you're doing something well, or you think you're going down a certain path. Whereas if you reflect on it, then perhaps you're not, and that allows you to see some of the gaps, which you can then start to address in whichever way works best for you.
Absolutely. And I think you also have to recognize that everyone else is in that same position, right? It's not unique to you as an individual.
No, that's for sure. You often do think of yourself as a little island, but everyone has those exact same struggles around you. It's a very complex, kind of evolving world of everybody that we're interacting with.
Exactly.
So what I'd love to do as we go into talking about GPOs is, if there are 3 things that you would really like listeners to take away from today's conversation, because I want to come back to those 3 things at the end of the show to make sure that, one, that we've covered them and that our discussion has achieved what we wanted it to, but also to tie some actions to them.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so if I think about a list of 3, and that's a short list, right? But especially in the context of GPO, I'd say, the first is leverage is not everything. So I'll expand on these a little bit more, but I think the summary is good. The second thing I would say is data matters, right? And the third thing I would say is that really not all GPOs are created equal. So if we look at that first one in more detail, I think I would say, suspend any disbelief that outcomes can't be mutually beneficial and that someone has to lose in order for you to win, right? If I contextualize that in procurement, I think it's really transcending the notion that leverage is everything. I would also say, specific to the GPO space, there has maybe been a historical view that it's purely a level of who's carrying the biggest stick, or maybe who can inflict the most pain on a given supplier.
Right.
I'd say our approach is much different than that. We work deeply with our supplier partners and provide kind of high levels of visibility and reporting, which enables them to make very targeted pricing decisions. And I think that turns out to be more favorable for our clients. And if you think about it, it also really reduces a risk, which is prominent in the market, of deals that get put in place and end up not being profitable for a supplier and really compromising kind of the value proposition, right? The second one is data matters. As I kind of noted in my first comment, data is increasingly important to both our clients and our supplier partners. And obviously that importance is going to continue to increase. We have the unique ability, I think, to kind of lean on our procurement heritage as a firm, really to kind of identify, monitor, and bring forward relevant insights from kind of the immense amounts of data that we manage on behalf of our clients. Yeah. We kind of see those insights as really continuing to drive the competitiveness of the GPO programs and really fuel the value adds. If you think about things like demand management and creating adjacencies within those programs to kind of maximize addressable spend. The third point is, not all GPOs are created equal. And I say that, or at least not designed equal. We published a white paper last year titled Why GPOs Sometimes Fail. And if you assume for a moment that kind of most GPOs are relatively similar from a pricing perspective on things like office supplies and rental cars and multifunction machines, and you also assume that those programs would drive some savings for your organization, you start to have to think about what are the real decision criteria, right? I would propose that pricing is a portion of the story. So really, we've invested heavily on the analytics and category management platforms to help our clients maximize value in the programs that they're participating in. And we have strong data that confirms elements like compliance and pricing accuracy, significantly influence the stated savings. We definitely don't want our clients sort of left holding the bag, so to speak, in terms of, what they said the partnership would deliver versus is what it actually does deliver.
Okay, well, I want to come back to those three in pretty short order. I had some probably more fundamental questions around GPOs, just a couple, because I want to make sure that for everybody who's listening, there may be some folks who haven't engaged or worked with a GPO before, and it probably just helps give a little bit of color to the rest of the conversation. So from a GPO itself, if you could just give a real primer on what a GPO looks like, what it is, and perhaps what the commercial model is.
Absolutely. So first, I'd say that it's changing. Historically, I think you could quickly describe, the commercial model as a coalition of the willing, right? Very literally aggregating spend to achieve an economy of scale that a single client really might not be able to reach on their own. Yeah. And that pillar of the foundation, certainly still exists. It's without question, though, that an evolution and an adaptation are kind of required in the market today. You've got things like vendor consolidation and the Amazon effect, sort of the proliferation of the B2C, market. All these things are kind of creating this dynamic change at a macro level, really requiring supplier partners to pivot. So we kind of feel it's our responsibility to maintain kind of the integrity of the fundamental model, but ensure that we pivot, or better yet, get ahead of the market in that capacity. Yeah.
What's the role as a GPO then against an Amazon marketplace, for example, or eBay has their own marketplace? When you're starting to get technology that enables a lot of this, leveraged purchasing, where do you kind of stack up? Or what's a differentiator do you see going forward of a GPO versus that more maybe I'm doing a disservice for a GPO versus technology, but what I see as a technology-enabled environment that companies are starting to install?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I would say that there's probably not a complete answer to that yet, because the evolution is still happening, right? And it's actually kind of, I think we would still view it sort of, kind of on the front end of that curve. It is interesting, though, and if I kind of take Amazon as a specific example, or probably Marketplace more appropriately, the commercial or the enterprise space has not adopted that methodology or that mentality or that approach in full effect by any stretch, right? Now that has to change over time. I mean, we have generational shifts happening, in our procurement organizations. The way that people buy at home translates to the way that they buy at work, right? I mean, that's just a given. So I think we're still very much on the front end of that sort of transition or that evolution. What I would say, I think for us, is we're starting to see things, from a GPO perspective, almost more in the lens of a kind of a category as a service model, right? Where it's really not as, I guess, relevant exactly how the pricing is structured or exactly how the technology is developed or what, it's really more the experience and the outcomes, right? And so we definitely kind of focus our attention on analysis, insights, and actions, kind of across not only our GPO programs, quite frankly, but our broader business.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting kind of framing as a category as a service. I wonder if you could maybe share some of the categories that you see as being the best position to benefit from a GPO relationship.
Sure. I would say, pretty much any of kind of the velocity type categories. Yeah. So if you think about categories that either have a high velocity of purchases, a large amount of SKUs, sort of dynamic changes to those SKUs individually and kind of their pricing. Also fragmentation across the enterprise, right, where you've got lots of different buyers. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where you start to see the value of kind of the analysis, right, the insights, and then kind of giving yourself a roadmap against what you're seeing within your own enterprise, because each one is different, right? So the programs fundamentally might be built kind of in the GPO principles, if you will, but their application and the implementation, vary by client.
Yeah, what was something that's interesting to me is, one of my earlier assumptions of GPOs was there was kind of a one size fits all. It's for small businesses that can't invest or don't have it doesn't make sense from an ROI perspective to invest in a strategic procurement capability. So let's just switch on a GPO. When, we were talking in the pre-interview a lot about the spend stack and how GPO really just fits a small portion of your entire organizational spend, but for that fraction of spend, it can be very effective.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think you actually asked me sort of, are GPOs only for small businesses?
Right.
And I would answer that with absolutely not. And I would say probably you have experience to point to, right, where you've got large organizations with very immature or mm-hmm. understaffed procurement functions, and then you might also have smaller companies that actually have surprisingly mature procurement functions, and they actively and effectively manage, the categories within their domain. So I think it's a disjustice to sort of dismiss one side or the other. Mm-hmm. I really think it sort of boils down to the desired goals. Obviously, savings is a given, right? I think it generally wouldn't make sense for companies to utilize a program that didn't drive some level of savings. However, I would challenge anyone to kind of look beyond sort of the first bite of the apple, and when you're evaluating GPO strategy, and certainly look to partners that can kind of clearly articulate what that long-term value might look like. Specific to large companies, I think it's an interesting sort of perspective, because we actually find that larger companies find a lot of value kind of in the compliance and category management aspects, mm-hmm. even more so to some extent than kind of just the pure savings, right? So, I'd say our programs, at least relative to Insight GPO, were built with, kind of levers and opportunities for us to effectively flex to meet the needs of kind of larger buyers. And so, again, with fragmented spend, with lots of buyers, stuff we were kind of talking about earlier, high velocity, you can really leverage those toolkits, right, to better manage that spend. And we help our clients do that. The other thing I would add is, we also have these very complementary pieces of our business, things like Spend HQ and Spend Visibility, right, Insight Analytics, mm-hmm. to address segments of spend that may even be outside of the traditional GPO scope, where we can really kind of design a comprehensive approach to kind of maximize outcomes for the client.
Yeah, because I see that engaging with a GPO, perhaps under the traditional model, it may be effective as a one-time cost savings, because you're banking on the fact that they have negotiated a better deal with a rental car provider or a stationary mm-hmm. provider, an office products provider. But that's great one time, but it doesn't necessarily bring you sustainable value. So once the first year is gone, then maybe the value of actually engaging in it is diminished. Do you see that? You talked earlier about one of the three things was leverage is not enough. Is there a point in time where it doesn't really make a big difference to the deal that a GPO can get with a provider by adding a few more $1 million of spend? they get to a certain point where the deal is the deal, and they're probably not going to get anything better out of that provider because it just doesn't make sense. There's only so much margin to be had.
Yeah, and I think that's acutely evident in the healthcare space, and certainly starting to reach that in the commercial space. I think it's fair to say, right, most of the commercial GPO programs, if you isolate it to pricing, are very similar, right? And they are, exactly similar in terms of the supplier brands that sit within that portfolio for the most part, right? So you're absolutely right. I think we have a lot of data that kind of backs up the way that we look at analytics and category management. What we find, is that an active program really drives somewhere between 2 to 4% savings annually. Yeah. And again, there's a lot of different mechanisms or kind of levers that go into that. But your initial statement, really, it's I think you can have a high level of confidence by utilizing a GPO, right? But it's what happens next is really what becomes most important. And I think that's really the evolution that we're seeing, and we're investing heavily into that evolution.
So as a buyer of a GPO service, so let's say it's you have a few categories that are under contract through a GPO relationship. What can you actually do working with your GPO to make sure that you maximize the value of those deals over time versus throwing it over the wall, saying that's great, I get this nice contract that I didn't have access to before, users have at it. What can I actually do proactively to make the most out of both the relationship with the GPO but also that supplier relationship too?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it first off, it's partner with the right fit for your organization, right? Mm-hmm. So you as a buyer, as a consumer, are going to know what's going to make the most impact within the context of your organizational profile, right? So it's choose the right partner. So if visibility and sort of management are your most important aspects, then that may sort of select one partner. If absolute savings and sort of fit and forget kind of model is your choice, then that would be right. So the good thing is that there's choice in the market for consumers, right? For the consumers of the services. I think generally speaking, it is good to make sure that the connection, right, with your partner is in fact a partnership, right? So the business reviews are important. I think throughout the sort of the life cycle of, at least in my experience of GPO, right, a lot of it has sort of sat with the supplier, which is great because the supplier has the information, that they're good at what they do, and that should be in place. However, I think the GPOs have a responsibility to also be a somewhat objective eye on what the supplier is providing to the client, right? Because at the end of the day, I would love to tell you that everybody's a fit for a GPO and everyone should utilize those programs, but that is not categorically the case. And it doesn't mean that just because today was the right move, 6 years from now it's the right move, right? So it's just being prepared sort of to evolve. And then, I would say keeping an eye on the ball in that capacity.
And so as the buyer of the GPO, of the contract through a GPO, is my governance with the GPO provider, or is my governance still directly with the supplier? Like, am I essentially outsourcing the management of the supplier relationship to the GPO provider, or how involved should I still be in that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and this does actually vary by GPO, right? So there are some that have strict governance between themselves and the client or the member. I would say in all cases, the GPOs have largely done a good job at letting the suppliers be good at what they do, right? So I think they get this part of it right. The key kind of as a GPO provider is to enhance the supplier relationship. And that comes, primarily in the form of, senior executive engagement or enhanced sales coverage, those types of things. But there are absolutely differences between the way each of the different GPOs engage with their clients. And so, you do have to kind of measure that in terms of your decision process in electing a GPO.
Okay. You mentioned just I think the answer prior, but I wanted to come back to it about, clearly GPOs aren't for everybody. There has to be certain things in place to be able to maximize the value of a GPO relationship. I wonder if there's any particular flags that you look for that determine whether a client or a prospect is actually a good fit for a GPO or not.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to just sort of speak from our experience here, because I think it might be unfair for me to speak about others specifically. Yeah. But I think, in terms of our firm, we have a client first, kind of mentality. So obviously our firm is broader than just the GPO. And so I would say that, having a partner that's able to be objective on some level is valuable, right? Because at the end of the day, we have clients that find value in leveraging the GPO programs, and we have clients that we are going to recommend an alternative path. And that's largely driven, really by their profile. Unfortunately, there's not a binary approach to kind of scoring whether they are or aren't. Right. Frankly, we might get into the process of evaluating the GPO and say, you know what, guys, this is probably not the best fit, and here's why, right? So I think it's kind of having a partner that can tell you that, or has the opportunity to tell you that objectively, and then being able to take action against that, right? So I think, again, from our experience and from my perspective, it's very much, having the opportunity to be objective, and then, being upfront with a client on whether or not we see that as an area of opportunity.
So if I flip that to the buyer side and I'm contemplating different GPOs, what should I look for that differentiate a GPO who wants to work a bit more holistically in terms of getting the most out of those categories, and you're looking at it more at a category level than a deal level, and those that just want me because they want to add my volume to the deals that they already have?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think I would focus primarily on the additional aspects of the relationship, right? What technologies are in place, sort of what methodologies are in place, right? How is that partner coming to a decision on a given supplier, right? I think, again, if I just sort of reflect internally, as a firm, we have, we've been focused exclusively on the procurement space for 15 years. We've done thousands of sourcing exercises. We've processed 1.5 trillion in spend data. It's kind of that we've got the T-shirt, so to speak. And I mean that in the purest sense that, we've seen what suppliers do. We see what clients do. We kind of know how the market reacts. So I think that knowledge base is highly valuable as well, right? So it's really just kind of evaluating the partner holistically versus, what categories and what's my savings, right? That's it. That's kind of where it is.
Yeah, and kind of what's the strategy for my out years? If you look at it, first year as being this is where I'm going to get the benefit of the reduced cost. Well, what does the years 2, 3, 4, depending on what that engagement looks like, what does that look like, and how am I going to get the most value out of that category? However you define value over those years, as opposed to it just being a one-time transaction to get a little bit lower cost next year.
That's right, and I think it's also having a partner that really holds the supplier accountable, right, to the pricing that they've offered, and then kind of the other thing to that is really there are gaps in the market, as fundamental as savings tracking, right, where we've seen partners that don't provide that level of visibility. And so I think that's a question mark, right? And that may not be important to you as a buyer. You have to make that decision, but we have seen, gaps all the way from savings, right? Savings tracking all the way up to, kind of full-blown category management. So it's really just kind of aligning yourself with the right fit for you.
So there's a couple of questions that I wanted to come back to from earlier, actually, that I should have asked earlier. One of them is more kind of fundamental to the model, but I think it still builds on some of the things we've just been talking about. And that's, what is the benefit to a supplier of even participating in a GPO? Because the assumption has always been, oh, it's just a way that it reduces their sales staff because now they only need to sell to one company versus having to sell to 50 companies or whatever that may be. But by the sounds of it, they still have a lot of kind of governance and supplier management involved, which probably makes that a moot point. So why are they interested in essentially giving up some of their margin points to work with a GPO rather than working directly with a company?
Sure. And again, I would answer this with that there's been a bit of an evolution. I think the initial sort of interaction did kind of start with, efficiencies from a sales perspective, maybe reaching markets. If I think back to private equity, reaching markets that were, largely unattainable by the suppliers on their own, right? So there were key relationships that might have been out there. So definitely there was a scalability that I think early on, that was provided to the suppliers. And again, keep in mind from a commercial perspective that a lot of that was influenced by the healthcare expansion, right? So the genesis of this kind of idea really goes back 35, 40 years or so ago when large healthcare organizations started to outsource that, their procurement to this GPO concept, right? So I think, the suppliers were somewhat conditioned, if you will, by virtue of that healthcare market. So I think that was kind of the initial case. Obviously, as you can imagine, there was some significant growth in the GPO, or has been significant growth in the GPO space over the last 10, 15 years, right? So a lot of the suppliers, were able to translate that value internally in their organizations. I mean, I've seen suppliers actually build entire teams around, this concept. So I think, again, it started to become more mainstream, right, for suppliers. Yeah. So I think it was less about them selling the dream and more about them executing against what they were seeing. I think if we talk about now, where is it moving? I think now we're really kind of getting back to that one of my points earlier, which data matters, right? Yeah. So, there's really a value proposition to suppliers in kind of, for lack of a better term, the stickiness, right, of having something being represented by something that transcends them as a category, right? Them as a commodity, right? So we know supplier partners have really been commoditized in recent years, and so they're looking for ways to diversify, and so I think they do see the GPOs. At least at a fundamental level, as a good opportunity to help kind of deploy that diversification, first off. And then, again, if I kind of reflect on Insight specifically, we're providing some pretty interesting levels of visibility for them, kind of even to their own data, right, where, market benchmarks and that type of stuff to kind of help them guide more accurate pricing and more more consistent pricing. So I think there's kind of multiple value points, but it certainly is evolving.
So how do you, as a GPO, select which partner to work with in any given category? Do you select one? Are you having relationships with, let's say it's a market that has three main players. Are you having relationships with all three of them? I'm interested to kind of know whether the relationship between you and a supplier is very transactional, so it's just price oriented, or if it's far more strategic than that, and there's a number of reasons why you choose to focus on supplier A versus supplier B in that category.
Sure, it's a good question, and again, I'd say that there's not an absolute answer here. I think there are categories where we contract with multiple suppliers. I would say, first off, at our core, right, we're a procurement organization. Yeah. There's 100 plus folks in this firm that are specifically focused on procurement. So the same rigor and process that we put into any strategic sourcing effort goes into our GPO programs, right? So it is a selection not only of price but of value, and we select suppliers that can execute against the value that they propose. So again, it sort of goes without question that you have to be competitive from a pricing perspective, right? But again, based on our experience and what we do as a firm, we have a very good handle on what is and what is not competitive in the market. From a pricing perspective, from a terms and conditions perspective, all of those things, right? So we layer that all into the decision process from a GPO perspective.
Yeah, and I don't know if you see the same. My experience when I was in procurement services delivering outsourcing engagements was that most of the providers in the marketplace know that what is competitive, where the market is, what value looks like. And so it actually makes those conversations far more around what may historically have been nuances or edges to find different ways to create value, as opposed to just being a cost conversation, because they know what the cost should be. Exactly.
And it's really neat because, recent conversations with suppliers is, sharing information with them around what compliance looks like when a client's in a GPO versus when they're not in a GPO, and those types of things. And so that drives, real interesting discussions with suppliers around, and kind of back to the earlier question about, well, how can we leverage that more effectively, as a partner to a GPO?
Now, we talked a couple of times about data matters. It was one of the 3 points you brought up at the beginning.
Yeah.
From a buyer perspective, again, I'm engaging with a GPO and I'm working in a particular category. Like, what kind of data makes your job easier to get the best deal that you can for me, or to place me within the best contract that you have at your disposal within that category? Is there certain things that you need from us that you sometimes you get, sometimes you don't, but that impact the value that I'm going to get out of that engagement?
Yeah, and I think, it's a good question. I think, you sort of have to segment what makes a very effective savings analysis, and then, what's valuable in terms of the negotiation. I mean, those to me are kind of two separate things. So what I would say is when someone's looking at a GPO, it's important to make sure that during the process, the GPO is able to effectively weigh all aspects, right? So if you think about, I'll give you a really good example right now, right? Just in general, in the office supply space, I mean, paper pricing has taken increases consecutive quarters, right? Yeah. Just in general, things are just, that is shooting up, right? So what ends up happening a lot of times, and this is not relegated to GPOs. I think this is just a fallacy in evaluation across the board. Is people are looking at average price, right, versus their last price paid, and I mean it's a simple concept, but in a world where you've seen 4 quarters consecutive increases or whatever, right, that becomes material. So if you're looking at it may be a year's worth of data, but that average may be averaging down based on the early purchases in that year of data, and it skews what would be the savings analysis. Okay. So it's important to have an open dialogue with whatever partner you're engaging in to not only cover items like that, right, things like that, but also terms and conditions in the contract that may or may not reside in the GPO contract.
So as we start to wrap up, I want to return back to those 3 different areas that we wanted to cover, starting to call them the power of 3, really, from the top of the show. So as you take those into consideration, what are 3 actions that a listener can take away and actually put into practice this week that will help them, that tie into those 3 success factors that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, for sure. So just to kind of recap those 3, it was, leverage is not everything, right? Data matters, and not all GPOs are created equal. And I'd say in terms of action, I'd kind of tie 1 and 3 together. Be a seeker, right? Be open and explore to look at these GPO programs, look at the differing models, and look at the differing philosophies. Sort of learn more and be open to how they might help you achieve your goals. That said, I would offer that, sort of bidding GPOs against one another is probably not an effective strategy. But as I said earlier, it's kind of safe to assume that, the level of pricing delta is really pretty small between the major providers out there. So it's really just finding the model that fits for you as an individual and you as an organization. In terms of the data, I think it's really impactful just to take a step back and take inventory of your data visibility, right? Start to note how you either feel you are or are not leveraging that information today, and quite frankly, what information you have access to, right? And then bring those either sort of shortcomings and or if you feel you have high levels of visibility, right? Bring that to the conversation so that you can have kind of an effective discussion and discovery around that potential partnership.
Okay. That all leaves us to the very last question, which is if listeners do want to connect, learn a little bit more, where can they do that? Where can they find you?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And I will say to you and all the listeners, I'm really excited about this podcast format. It's actually my first time to do this, so I'm always super interested in new mediums, to connect with people, kind of as I mentioned earlier, right? So I would say, our website for sure. So we recently published a video series on our website from leaders of all of our practices, actually, and I'm included in that. So certainly our website has a ton of information and would encourage everybody to check that out. We also have a lot of sort of the knowledge share there, right? So our white papers and a ton of that type of stuff. So I think that's the best place to connect. And then, obviously, there's opportunities to kind of click through and link with any of us that you'd like to speak with.
Sure. Well, what I'll do is I'll include the white paper that you referenced earlier. I'll put your website, and I'll also include a link to your LinkedIn profile, all in our show notes, so listeners can go and find you. And those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/jblack. That's artofprocurement.com/jblack. Jay, thank you very much for joining me.
Bill, thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.